Hi, and welcome back to ManaTutor MTG Draft. We're back after a pretty quiet January and excited to have the limited community reunited for the release of Aetherdrift. Today we'll be going over the draft archetypes, our thoughts on the big picture of the format, and as usual, our grading backed color and archetype rankings. So strap yourselves in for a wild ride. So up first in our archetypes, we have blue-white. And I'm going to read off what Mark Rosewater put as the description of the archetypes here. So white-blue is a slow, controlling archetype that builds up a board of artifact creatures to eventually overwhelm your opponent. It has artifact synergies that play well with vehicles. And here you have your two signposts. Every archetype has a non-vehicle signpost card and a vehicle signpost card, which we are showing here. Up first, for the non-vehicle signpost, we have Voyage Home, 5 white and a blue for a sorcery. It has affinity for artifacts, which makes sense with what we just heard about the artifact synergies. You draw 3 cards and gain 3 life. And that'll be pretty nice for obvious card advantage. 7 mana is pretty expensive, but with your affinity for artifacts, that should come in quite a bit lower by 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then cards like this are really helpful when they gain you life in order to get back some time as well. So in your control deck, this will be valuable. And then we have Guide Light Pathmaker. For 4 white-blue, you get a 6/5 artifact vehicle with Vigilance. When this vehicle enters, you may search your library for an artifact card and reveal it. Put it onto the battlefield if its mana value is 2 or less. Otherwise, put it into your hand, then shuffle. This will be an interesting one. It's obviously a very big Vigilance artifact creature with a little bit of card advantage value there as well. I'm a little bit less excited for this particular vehicle compared to some of the other ones that we have, but we will see how that plays out.
Yeah, it's a bit pricey, but it does get you 2 in theory on the board. Yeah. So next up, we have blue-black, and blue-black is a slow and steady bleeder type deck where you gum up the board and use a variety of cards to slowly plink away your opponent's life total. Now, the 2 signpost on commons we have here. The first one's actually one of my favorites. I think you and I both really like this card, and I think it's probably going to appear in our top uncommons. Haunt the Network. So for 3 and a blue and a black, you get a sorcery, choose target opponent, create 2 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. Then the chosen player loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of artifacts you control, right? So at a minimum, this is draining for 2, but you are hoping to hit this for much more, like 5, 6, somewhere in that vicinity. And that's a 12-point swing in life totals, right? In terms of respective to your opponent. This card is going to end games. It's going to be, really, really good, I think, overall, particularly if you can get into the 10, 12, 14 artifacts, in your deck range, which shouldn't be too difficult to do with the number we have. And then the other one we have, Haunted Hellride. For 1 colorless, 1 blue, and 1 black, you get the artifact vehicle signpost uncommon. It's a 3/3 with crew 1. And whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. Untap it. So this is great because it's going to give you an attacker, right? You can use it on this if you want. You can use it on another attacker. Give it Death Touch, and it's going to make it very painful for your opponent to block, right? And if they don't block it, you get to keep it as a defender. So this is going to also be, I think, a really great signpost uncommon for this. I think I like it a little bit less than Haunt the Network, but nonetheless still a really good card.
Up next, we have Black-Red. Black-Red is an aggressive beatdown deck that takes advantage of Start Your Engines and max speed to upgrade your attackers. And so you'll see we have Gastel Thrillseeker here with Black-Red for a 2/3 Lizard Berserker creature. It has Start Your Engines. This is the first time we're seeing this mechanic, but basically when you see Start Your Engines, you have a speed of 1 at that point, and then it increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life, and you get up to max speed 4, and that's usually where your impact will trigger. There's a few cards in the set that do take advantage of what your speed is at, even if it's less than max speed, but for the most part, the vast majority of the cards that care about this are caring about when you hit max speed. And so on this one, when this creature enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent and you gain a life, and it has max speed. This creature has Death Touch and haste. So At a bare minimum, you're getting a 2/3 above rate creature that starts your engines on turn 2, which is important so that you can take advantage of starting to deal damage to your opponent and increasing the speed that you're at. And this one does that right away, which is great, right? Like when it enters, it deals that 1 damage, putting you straight to 2 speed right there. So that's a good signpost uncommon creature. We also have the vehicle Apocalypse Runner for 2 black red. You get a 6/5 artifact vehicle with crew 3, but it has a tap ability, which, by the way, this doesn't have Summoning Sickness coming into play, right? Because it's not a creature at that point. So you can use this right away. Tap target creature you control with power 2 or less gains lifelink until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. So it is nice to be able to basically have a 4-point life swing with draining for 2, most likely early on there. I will say I am also a little less thrilled about this particular vehicle compared to, again, like Gastel Thrill Seeker I like better is my point. But, you know, it is a big creature. Crew 3 is pretty expensive of a crew cost. But, you know, that is upside from the ability as well.
Yeah, and what I would say about this one is what I don't like about these two, that the previous two that we've had, is that they don't really synergize really well with the strategy of the colors, right? Well, Apocalypse Runner doesn't, right? Because it doesn't have start your engines, it doesn't take advantage of start your engines, and it feels a little disjointed, I think. So
I see where they're going with trying to still advantage the start your engines by really increasing your speed, right? Like making an unblockable creature to get on through to you know, so they assume you would have started your speed earlier in black red on turn 1 or turn 2, most likely in this color pair. But yeah, I agree. I'm not blown away by this particular signpost vehicle.
all right, so next up we have red green, and red green is a mid-range deck that uses the exhaust mechanic, which we haven't really talked about yet, to upgrade its creatures to impressive size. And so the first signpost uncommon we have here is the non-vehicle. It's Boom Scholar for 1 colorless, 1 red, and 1 green. You get a 3/3 creature that has the exhaust ability for 4 colorless, a red, and a green. You can exhaust it, which is an activatable ability that you can only use 1 time. Creatures and vehicles you control gain trample until end of turn. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. And then it also has the benefit that exhaust abilities of other permanents you control cost 2 less to activate. So it's going to really leverage all of your other cards in green and red that have that exhaust ability. Speaking of which, the other card we have is Rocketeer Boost Buggy, and it's for a green and a red. You get a 3/2 artifact vehicle. Whenever this vehicle attacks, you create a treasure token. It has crew 1, so it's fairly easy to crew, and it has an exhaust ability for 3 colorless. It becomes an artifact creature and put a +1/+1 counter on it. And so this card actually is going to be really great because I think you're going to play this on turn 2 and exhaust it on turn 3 and have a 4/3 that creates a treasure token and you're attacking in, which is going to be pretty good. I don't like that it's only going to have 3 toughness. I'd rather it be a 3/4, I think, but also pretty good still. So.
Yeah, and those exhaust abilities can be triggered at instant speed too, right? So that is a big plus for things like the trample effect, for example, if you just wanted to be able to do that on your own time. Up next, we have green-white, and green-white is another mid-range deck that encourages you to play a lot of vehicles and saddle with effects that'll help boost them on their path to victory. And so for our signposts, we have a mount creature here. So mounts are similar to vehicles, except they are creatures, but they have saddle in order to which acts like crewing, but you tap creatures up to that power and they get additional effects. So here is a mount that's a 1/1 flyer with saddle 1. Whenever it attacks while saddled, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target mounts and or vehicles. And then for our creature, we have Veteran Beast Rider. For 1 green-white, we get a 3/4. At the beginning of your end step, untap each creature you control. And it has 2 green-white creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So like both of these cards, the I like Veteran Beast Rider a bit better, just because of the upfront rate, as well as you could see a world where you double activate down the line the +1/+1 across your creatures. And the Legoran does require you to have another mount or vehicle in play to take full advantage of it, right? So it is a mount itself. It can put a +1/+1 counter on itself. But both reasonable creatures.
Yeah, I'd say I definitely agree with you. I like the Beast Rider more. I like the Beast Rider mostly because it's super aggressive. It basically forces your opponent to block, right? Because they're not going to be able to crack back with all of your creatures getting untapped. So, at that point, they either have to block and trade or lose creatures, or you just win the game. So, I really like that card just because, and the pump ability just makes it so your creatures are going to be able to either attack in or defend later on, regardless of how your opponent chooses to block, and you're going to be able to pump your whole board. So I think it's a really good card.
Yes, but that threat of activation too, right? They have to think about you could activate it,
Right.
on the attacks, and then hopefully you don't have to, and then you can save your mana to make another play post combat.
Activate it on the block, right? Yeah, I mean it's pretty brutal.
Yep.
Next up, we have White Black, and White Black is an aggressive attrition deck. Start your engines and max speed, which keeps up an endless army of attacking zombies while whittling away your opponent's resources. And our two signpost uncommons there are Embalmed Descendant, which costs 1 white, 1 black, and 1 colorless. For that, you get a zombie, a 1/2 creature. Start your engines, and when it enters, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature. So you're getting kind of above rate there in 2 different creatures. And then at max speed, whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. I like this card because it creates 2 bodies. It's going to be great for helping to crew things because it's going to create a 1/1 for your crew ones, a 2/2, or sorry, a 1/2, and then a 2/2 for your crew twos. So it's going to really help you, pump out those vehicles. And then speaking of which, for in the crew 2 range, we have Dune Drifter for X, white and a black. You get a 3/3 artifact vehicle. And when it enters, return target artifact or creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And it has a crew of 2. So I actually really like these 2 cards in combination with one another if you had both of them, right? Because Embalmed Descendant is going to get you a 2/2 on the board. Let's say your Embalmed Descendant dies for 5 mana, you can bring back Embalmed Descendant, later on in the game and get another 2/2 to crew your Dune Drifter, right? I think there's a lot of synergies to be had here. One thing I've noticed about black and white is there is a fair amount of graveyard recursion, and I think that while we didn't mention that in the description here, I do think that there's going to be a lot of recursion to sort of help bring back your resources while whittling away your opponents.
Up next, we have Blue Red. It's an aggressive deck that makes use of discard, mostly through cycling, to keep its card flow of attackers coming. And so we have Broadside Barrage. For 1 blue red, you get an instant with Broadside Barrage, deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, draw a card, then discard a card. And then we also have Boosted Sloop as your vehicle for 1 blue red. You get a 3/3 with crew 1. It has Menace. Whenever you attack, draw a card, then discard a card. So Broadside Barrage might be one of my favorite multicolor cards so far that we've seen.
It's good. I mean, 3 mana for 5 damage at instant speed is good no matter what, but the loot ability is just a nice bonus.
We've seen that across a lot of sets, how important loot is. In fact, that's kind of been my biggest learning point in the past couple of quarters here in Magic, is how important loots can be to smooth out your draws and get you the cards that you want. So I like both of these. I do like the Barrage more than the Sloop too. Just crew 1 is reasonable, but I guess the good part here is it's not whenever it attacks, it's whenever you attack. So it could be another creature attacking, getting you a loot. And so I do think that'll be pretty powerful.
Absolutely. Although you don't necessarily mind attacking with this because it has Menace, right? And a crew of 1 is not a bad crew cost to pay. It's not Dreadwing Scavenger, right? But it could be pretty close depending on how you use it, right? And there's a lot of mechanics there are a number of cards in blue and red that, whenever you discard a card, do X, right? Put a counter on something, create a treasure token. There's a number of different effects, I think, in that. So, you're really looking for those synergies, I think, here.
For sure.
All right. So next up, we have black green, and Black Green is a recursion centric deck that focuses on filling up its graveyard and returning large threats to the battlefield. So we talked a little bit about recursion in White Black. This is going to have a little bit of the same mechanic going on. And so first up, we have Broodheart Engine. For a black and a green, you get an artifact, not a vehicle, amazingly. But at the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1, so that's going to help power your graveyard. And then for 2 colorless, a black and a green, sacrifice Broodheart Engine, return target creature vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. So this is going to help you get something potentially big out. And speaking of big, we have Thundering Broodwagon, which is the vehicle in this archetype. And you get a 6/5 for 2 colorless, 2 black, and 2 green. Which this is probably going to be like the least splashable card in multicolor. But you get Menace and Reach. When it enters, destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. It has a crew cost of 3, and you can also cycle it for 2 colorless mana.
And that's where I see it as being a potentially still splashable card, is the cycling, right? If you cycle this and recur it, like let's say with there is a white recursion card for 4 mana. That would be a good use of recursion. So this set does support a good amount of fixing as well. So I do think you'll be able to do 3-color things. You are going to want to look for the overlaps of synergies when you do that. So for instance, I could see a black, green, white deck, right? That does all that recursion stuff.
Yeah. No, definitely. I just, and yes, if you have the recursion, I think you can definitely pull off the cycling with this, but just hard casting, less likely to splash this one.
Yeah. Up next, we have red-white. It's an aggro deck that has extra synergy with vehicles, so a little more straightforward. First here, we have Cloudspire Coordinator. For red and white, you get a 3/1 human pilot. When this creature enters Scry 2, you can tap it and create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens, where X is the number of mounts and or vehicles that enter the battlefield under your control this turn. The tokens have this token saddles mounts and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So you'll see that commonly come on up as these pilot creature tokens, these 1/1s that crew things with power 2 greater. And yeah, that's a pretty powerful card in of itself. I don't love the 1 toughness stat line because of these 1/1s that are around. But the fact that this scries 2 when it enters, that is not horribly far off from drawing a card. So so that's pretty powerful. And then we have Cloudspire Sky Cycle. For 2 red-white, you get a 2/3 artifact vehicle with flying. It has crew 1. When this vehicle enters, distribute 2+1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 other target vehicles and or creatures you control. Note, it does not say it must be 2. You can put 2 counters on one thing. Yeah. So, both pretty reasonable cards. I think a lot of the community really likes this Cloudspire Sky Cycle, and I'm a little bit more skeptical on this one. I don't think it's bad. But I'm personally more drawn to Cloudspire Coordinator here.
Right. And the one you were talking about, the 1 toughness on Cloudspire, and it's definitely a drawback, right? But more than likely you're going to either be using this for its tap ability or its ability to crew itself. To crew something at a crew 3 or whatever. So I think that's less of a drawback a little bit with this card, especially because it only costs 2, and like you said, the scry is good. But I think it's going to get you that little bit of extra push, right? Especially if you are playing a deck with a lot of mounts or vehicles, right? Like mostly mounts and vehicles. This will get you a lot of additional pilots and help you kind of go wide. So last up we have, and this is perennial, I say this all the time, what may be my favorite archetype, because I'm a sucker for blue-green, but I think in this case it might actually do pretty well. unlike most previous sets. We have blue-green, and this one is a ramp deck that builds up its mana to play large creatures and vehicles. It also uses that mana on exhaust costs to overwhelm the opponent. So first up, we have the Sky Serpent Seeker. It is a 1/1 flying death touch for a green and a blue. It has an exhaust ability for 4 colorless. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal 2 land cards. Put those land cards onto the battlefield tapped and put the rest on your library in a random order and put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. I really like this card. I like death touch on my creatures. I like flying on my creatures, and I like that this is going to really help you ramp, on turn 4 probably to have 6 mana on the board largely. And the +1/+1 counter is kind of gravy on top of that. I don't care a ton about it, but it's nice. And then the second, we have the vehicle. So for 1 colorless, 1 green, and 1 blue, you get a 3/5 vigilance. And whenever you activate an exhaust ability, create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And this has crew 1. So this, I think, is just an insanely good card, right? For just on a stat line, a 3/5 for 3 with vigilance. And the fact that it only costs crew 1 to activate is you're going to be able to have this out and use it as a creature most of the time. It's going to be able to either attack in or block a lot of your opponent's hate. And then, you just play some other exhaust things and you're going to go wide with it. So
any card that creates additional 1/1s in this set, I think will be especially valuable.
yeah.
So I like both of these cards a lot for the 1/1 creation, let alone the efficiency of that vehicle for Ranger's Aetherhive. And then the Sky Serpent Seeker, there's going to be a lot of ways to use your mana in this set as well. So that ramps you with 2, 2 onto the battlefield. That's not too commonly done for 4 mana, right?
Right.
And still you get a creature, out of that
+1/+1, yeah.
Yeah. So
I was gonna say, yeah,
and
you normally
fixing.
see, like, you might see a sorcery speed card that puts 2 onto the battlefield for 4 mana, but that's about it. That's about all you're getting with that. And now you're also getting a +1/+1 counter, right? Effectively. So
Yeah, and it's all within a card that is a creature, right? So
right.
it's not just no permanent in and of itself outside of the land. So
And I will add, I think there is, I don't know if it's a common or uncommon, but there is a card in either blue or green that lets you on your upkeep active, or not, maybe not on your upkeep. Once during each of your turns, you may activate an exhaust ability 1 additional time. And imagine if you could just do that every turn on Sky Serpent Seeker. I mean, like, come on. So, and then get a 1/1 if you also have Ranger's Aetherhive up.
yeah. So speaking about the big picture of this format, how will the mechanics play out? This is a different set, right? Like we haven't had really a vehicle focused set in Limited before. That is where vehicles are so prevalent, and they're usually in sets in the past not that good. They are so prevalent here that you have to account for them, right? They're built into the core of the set. So there's a few mechanics that I think will drive a bit of this format. One will be max speed. A lot of people are talking about how max speed is going to be the definition of this format. I will say I don't quite believe that. I think what's making people think that is the ring tempting mechanic from Lord of the Rings that drove that format, and max speed is not that. Max speed requires you to have cards in play to take advantage of your speed, where the ring tempting did not. It was inherent mechanics that you just got separately from your cards. And honestly, the max speed improvements, they're nice. They're going to determine games, but they aren't overwhelmingly impressive in my view. What do you think?
I mean, I agree largely. I think the one way in which I would say that I think max speed will be a little bit like ring tempt is that if you're going to go for it, you kind of have to go for it, and you kind of have to have enough cards in your deck to support it. It's like, I think we talked about this in the Lord of the Rings set. It, Ring Tempt was really only good if you got to some sort of critical mass of
Yeah.
cards with it, like 7, 8, 9 in your deck that allowed you to consistently get to like the level 4 of the Ring Tempt, right? Now here again, you're going to need to get to level 4. Now, you only need one card to start your engines and then a way to, make your opponent lose life on each of your turns after that. But you still need to get that, right? And if you only have 2 cards with max speed in your deck, you may not get there, right?
Yeah.
But if you have like 7 or 8 or 9 and they all have really good, effects that trigger at max speed, you're probably going to get there fairly consistently. And the thing about it is, like I think you said, is a lot of these cards, if you don't have max speed, are a little bit subpar,
Yeah.
right? And they're not all of them. There are a few that are like really good regardless, and some of them like at rare or like just bombs outright. And it doesn't matter. But like some of these, at common and uncommon particularly are not, they're not bad cards necessarily, but without like that ability that triggers at max speed, they're more like filler. And so if you want to go for max speed, you kind of have to go for it. And I think
Right.
that's the one area where I'd say it's a little bit like ring temp, but I agree. I don't think the mechanics are going to be as powerful.
Yeah, it's interesting because you definitely do want to hit max speed early on. So you
Yes.
want more capabilities of getting it because it will then take some, well, you want to start your engines early on such that you
Yes,
can get to
exactly.
max speed down the line over the course of the next 3 turns, whatever. And so, yeah, I think there'll be a different kinds of decks really care about hitting at different points in time. Your control decks the game can go longer, and so you can kind of get that advantage maybe a bit longer in the late game, whereas your aggro decks will want to try to get that advantage as soon as possible to get the game over early. But in general, I would say if I'm trying to do the max speed thing, I'd probably want to start your engines by turn 3 at least.
Oh, at least, yeah,
Yeah,
no, and
yeah.
and that means you need to have a lot of cheap cards with start your engines, right?
So
There's things that cost like 5 and 6 that have start your engines on it, and I'm like, okay, that's fine, but you're not going to want to do that on turn 5 or 6. You need to
right.
do that on turn 2, 3 at the latest, I would say, and then get there by turn 6 or 7, right? Like, yeah, because that's when you're going to be playing those bigger cards that potentially have max speed bonuses that you want to have in play immediately. So yeah, absolutely. That means you have to play like what 5 or 6 cards at least in your deck that cost 3 or less that have start your engine. So you kind of have
Yeah,
to
I
get
would
mass.
even at that point think of it like basic lands. When you're trying to main color something, you need at least 8 sources to hit by turn 3 type of thing. So if you want
Yeah,
to hit by turn 3, you're gonna want 8 sources of 3 mana or less.
right,
Start your engines. I do think there's some flexibility to go into like turn 4, turn 5, start your engines and still be okay
right.
for your control decks, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it depends on what's your goal. How quickly do you want to get to max speed?
Definitely, yeah, and but I do think, yeah, you're gonna need that critical mass, and if you just have 1 or 2 cards with max speed, I mean, if it's a good card and it fits in your deck, great, but like realize you're probably not gonna get there very often.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I do think the set will be a bit snowbally like that. Not, even if not for max speed, for like crewing things and having pilots and vehicles on board, right? Like you do need to get board presence, and getting on board early will matter just as much as it does in all sets. But I think that this set will kind of remind people a bit of like Lost Caverns Ixalan was one where it really did help to have a turn 1 play. I think
Mhm.
sometimes we talk about a turn 1 play isn't quite worth the card, even though they've had some good ones, recently as well. You're not always going for that. Well, in this set, I do kind of think you really you'll be looking for some good 1 drops,
Right.
along with some 2 drops and stuff like that. And there's not a whole lot of great ones, to be
No.
honest. Your commons and uncommons, like I was looking at our grades on them, and they're mostly season lower for
Yeah.
1 and 2 drops.
Yeah, I mean, there's good 2 cost removal, right? But there's not a
Yeah.
lot of good 2 cost, like, actual creatures that I'm like, "Hey, I would really like to play this in my deck."
Yeah, there's a lot of good
Aside from
cheap
some of the
removal.
uncommons, right? Like, we talked about some of the signposts that cost 2 that are pretty decent, but,
Yeah.
like, other than that, there's not a ton, I think, so.
Yeah, so that makes me think that this is going to be a bit slower of a set, right? Like, not only do you need to get vehicles on board and pilots to crew them to start having an impact, but like you said, the removal is pretty good, even pretty cheap. So, like, if they do get pilots on board, you can snipe those off, or you could delay the game, And yeah, I would expect this to be a bit slower than we have seen in the recent history of draft.
Definitely, yeah.
Also want to say, vehicles have historically not been great in limited, and I do think while the vehicles are good in this set, they made good vehicles. I think you do want to temper your use of them. You need creatures to crew your vehicles. The worst situation you can be in is a board full of vehicles with nothing to crew them. Now, some of them can be animated, right? Turn into creatures, in some way or another. So that helps. But I wouldn't focus too much on your common vehicles. You're going to want the vehicles you do have to be big role players. So more of your uncommon rare vehicles.
And I think you want to prioritize things with low crew costs. One, ideally two, sure. Three is like really pushing it though, because then you're tapping down a three cost, right, or like three power there to use that, and it needs to really have an impact on the board at that point.
Crew
So I
one's a
do.
lot cheaper than crew two, and because your two power that can be impactful to ending the game. You're going to want to attack with those two power creatures in a lot of cases. I mean, if the vehicle it's crewing is powerful enough, sure,
Right.
But crew one is quite a bit cheaper than crew two.
I would also say to prioritize vehicles that have evasion.
Yeah.
If you can get a vehicle that has flying or menace or even death touch to some extent, right? Like these are things that, like, okay, so maybe it has a 2 or a 3 crew cost, but that might allow you to get in a way that you can't get in with your creatures if the board's been gummed up, right? So I think that's another key point to think about. Another I thought I had is, like, I do think there will be avenues here for super aggro decks if your draft comes together the right way, where you can just get a bunch of really cheap cards out that are not vehicles, right? 1 cost, 2 cost, 3 cost stuff that you can just slam down on the board, with decent amounts of removal to clear the way, or things like lightning strike, so you can just hit your opponent and finish the game out potentially, and just go, ham in terms of, super aggro, and try and close out the game on turn 4 or 5. And I do think those decks may perform pretty well because they're just going to get in underneath so many of the other decks that are still building their board at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting, this format changing over time too. I think people aren't used to drafting vehicles and all this, and so I wonder what if they're just gonna go for all the vehicles kind of a thing, and then
Have no
I
one to
think
crew them.
yeah, like your aggro decks are going to get under that then, right? Like you'll be able to get in, but there's a lot of good cheap removal, and people know removal is good. So are they going to be prioritizing that as well to pick off your aggro start?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine we'll see it like we did before, that aggro performs decent early, but I do think after a couple weeks that there will be a greater shift to control, which we usually see, but I just have this feeling that the speed of the format will be a bit higher than we've been used to seeing in sets like Duskborn and Bloomburrow and things like that.
Yeah.
I do want to mention I'm very excited for the cycling decks as well. Cycling is an inherently good way to turn a card that would be good only in a given situation to a free buyout, right? So this is especially important for cards that are good early, cheap cards that then also have cycling, such that when you draw them late, they have that buyout of, I don't need this 2-mana play anymore. I'd rather have something more effective. Let's cycle. Cycling also helps you limit how many lands you have to play. So for every 2 cheap cyclers about, you can consider cutting a land. You don't want to go too crazy on that, right? But that can help you keep into having more plays as well with a lower land count. And I do want to mention, there's cycling costs all over the place. Cycling 1 is quite a bit better than cycling 2, which is obviously better than cycling 3. But yeah, your cycling 1 cards will be interesting, especially with all the discard trigger advantages that are coming with colors like blue-red, which I'm pretty excited about because I think that's actually going to be a performer in this set compared to how it usually is the forgotten about archetype.
Yeah. I will say one thing I was thinking about with the cycling is I almost wish they had created a new keyword ability that allowed you to pay 2 to discard the card and create a 1/1 pilot.
Hmm.
Just saying, just free idea for you there, Wizards. Like you know, for anybody who might be watching from Wizards, like that would have been, I think, a very thematic thing to have in this set. But you know,
You don't draw a
basically,
card though, right?
no,
It's
no, no,
just
no, no,
discard, get
not
the
also
pilot.
draw
Yeah,
a
yeah,
card. Just
yeah.
instead of drawing the card, or give you a choice. You know, cycling allow you to discard, draw, or create a 1/1 pilot and give you a little bit of flexibility, right? Because
Yeah.
cycling 2 kind of sucks. Cycling 1's a lot better, obviously. But essentially, like giving you that choice of, you know, getting the 1/1 pilot or something like that for 2 mana, which isn't a really great, you know, or overpowered thing,
Right.
but could allow you to crew a vehicle or something. So
When you need it, like, yeah, this set could have really leveraged that.
right, yeah. Anyways, just
Who
an idea.
knows? Next job for Matt is a game designer over at Wizards.
No, no, thank you. I don't need the kind of hate those people get.
And then lastly, we want to talk about exhaust. I think a lot of people are throwing shade on exhaust as something that's going to be not as prevalently used. And I would somewhat disagree. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be the most prevalent mechanic in this whole set or anything like that, but you know, if our theory is right that this is a little bit slower of a set than we are typically seeing, exhaust I think is a decent mana sink in this format.
Yeah, I like exhaust. I think exhaust is going to be a useful ability to have. Um, you know, I think it makes the cards that have it better. It sometimes makes your whole board better. And you know, it's going to be one of those things where it's like having an extra card, right? It's like it's usually an slightly overcosted thing in most cases, not all. We talked about a couple that weren't, but you know, there's enough synergies with it that I think it's going to work pretty well in the decks that are able to leverage it. And I don't think it's a thing you need to. It's not like you need to have 8 or 10 cards with exhaust to make it super good. Just a few could really help swing the game, and so I think it'll be good. But you know, we'll see how it shakes out.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of get an idea of what it is like as reverse adventure, right? Like it's
Right.
playing the card up front, and then you can activate from the card some other
Ability, yeah.
ability, right?
But the
Like
adventure cards were good,
yeah,
right? Like it's like
yeah,
it gives you flexibility, it gives you a choice, it gives you essentially 2 cards in one. And while neither of them may be completely overpowered on your own, just having more plays and more things to do than your opponent has is generally a good thing.
for sure. You do need to be careful about it though, because there is a lot of good removal in this set. You can get blown out.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
you know, if you're exhausting something that just grows your current creature, right, and then in response they destroy it, like that was a wasted moment. So you have to figure out what your exhaust is doing, you know, and then if your opponent has mana open, so it's a tricky way to play, but
a lot of the exhaust abilities do other things, right?
right.
And so in that case, you're not going to get 2 for 1 necessarily because like the ability will still resolve. So.
Yep.
But yes, yeah, ones that just put counters on that creature or something like that. Yeah, you need to be super careful about that.
Yeah, I guess for the most part, I would you know, rate the cards that give you some other benefit outside of improving your own creature for exhaust as higher than those that pump your creature.
Yeah.
So we've talked about some color pairs that we're interested in. Maybe it's a good segue to get into strengths of colors and then these archetypes. So let's pull that up. For those of you that are new to our grading system, we have graded cards from A+ to F and sideboard on a scale of zeros up through D, and then D+ at 1. The reason we start at D+ is because those are typically the lowest cards you're looking to get into your deck that have some value to you, all the way up to A+ at 10. And we only graded the commons and uncommons and then took the average of those grades for each color. And as you'll see here, we get an average ranging between about a C- to C+ range for those commons and uncommons. And for red, we saw that as the strongest color at a 3.31 average. So a little bit basically between a C to a C+. And then blue, 3.11. White actually was tied with that at 3.11. Green, a little bit lower, 2.97. And then black was a pretty clear last at 2.61. So the takeaway I have here is right now, and the way too early color rankings before any games were played, is that red is the strongest. White, blue, and green are in the middle, and then black is a clear last place. And I think that last piece is the biggest takeaway, is knowing what colors you should try to lean away from and avoid early in the format. And we have a pretty good track record of getting that right across all the different sets. So I feel reasonably confident that we got it right here. It's not to say it's unplayable.
Right.
It's not to say that you should hard avoid it even. Right. Whereas I think the last set we said to hard avoid was Foundations Green, and that was true until later in the format. And I think black will come back and be more powerful later in the format as things even out as well. But I am looking to soft avoid black in the early weeks of this format.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I agree with that, as much as I don't like to agree with it, because I happen to really like playing black. But
yeah, I think it's both of our favorite color, by the way.
Right. So I think, I don't love that overall, but I'm interested to try some other things out and see where they end up. That said, I mean, there is a lot of good removal in black, right? Like there's still really good removal in black. And so, I agree with like the soft avoid, but I think if you see yourself getting past like, 2, 3 really good black removal cards, and you've only got your main color, you might consider black as the second, right?
Yeah.
And so you just kind of have to see what happens. I think there's any number of decks that could absolutely smash with black in them. It's just going to depend on the cards you get.
And I think what you just said was key there, is like, maybe don't start in black, but be open to pivoting in black when you compare it with a color that works well with it. And I do think there are several colors that pairs that are a little bit questionable here. Like green-black recursion in almost every set has been pretty bad, and I haven't seen enough to convince me otherwise. Yeah, like think like white-black recursion in Duskborn, for example. Like that was one of the color pairs to avoid, and they tried to push the recursion because there's a lot of graveyard within Duskborn, right? It still didn't get there.
Right.
And yeah, so I haven't been convinced that that's a great archetype. Similarly, white-black, I'm skeptical of, and that's because it's pitched, at least from Mark Rosewater, as an aggressive pair, and black does not have any aggressive commons. It is clearly a control archetype, and white has some aggressive commons, but it's like half and half. It's split half. Yeah, exactly. So if you're half aggro, half control, and then your other color is completely control, not enough support for really an aggro type of deck. Red is all aggro, right? So like that, you might be able to get away with red aggro with black clearing the way and doing the controlling end at the top.
Color, or some of those signpost uncommons we went over.
Blue-black, I think, will work well too, because they're both control, right? Like blue can do some aggro, or at least be your top end control to aggro, but blue-black control, I think, will be reasonable too. So I would, before going into black, want to be in either red or blue first.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of borne out by these rankings, right? In terms of our overall archetype rankings, right? Like obviously blue-black and red-black are kind of the top two black archetypes, more or less, right?
Yeah. In fact, the bottom 5 are all your black archetypes minus the white-blue there. But black, red, and blue-black are higher. So yeah. Out of these, I'd be looking to avoid white, black, and black, green. There's enough of a jump down there from blue, white. I think I'd be willing to play blue, white still, even though it's the third last, all the way up to, the top being blue, red. We'll see.
First time we've seen blue, red on top in a really long time. So we'll see how that that might be a bit of a hot take here, but we'll see how that turns out.
Yeah, we might be biting our tongues after seeing it, but this time it does look promising. Red and blue were the top 2 colors, from the last slide as well. So, and the signposts both look pretty decent for that. So
yeah, I mean, like we may be eating our words here in a week or two, but we'll see. For now, we're gonna go out there with the hot take that
Yeah.
blue red might be the place to be in this set. And the thing is, it's not really as much as it normally is. It's not really like a spells color. It's focused on the draw and discard, right? And things getting bigger when you discard, or doing things when you discard. So I think it's a different mechanic than you would normally see with like prowess, or other types of like just casting a ton of spells. So we'll see.
And it's pitched as an aggro archetype, which it normally
Right.
isn't, right? And so it is promising that, again, early in the format, aggro decks overperform. So that early in the format, this comes out swinging. In fact,
Skeptical blue will ever be an aggro color, but
I do think you probably would lean more on your red cards for your aggro piece, right? And then the blue clears the way. But yeah, red green beatdown, pretty aggro too. That's right behind white red, always more of an aggro. White green is mid range, so that gets on in there too. Blue green not being last place or second to last place is another hot take as well.
Yeah, I'm interested to try it. I always love a good blue green deck. Like I loved it, and I wanted to do so well in Bloomborough, and it just didn't. I'm still dreaming of the time when Pond Prophet wins me games.
Well, blue green was a decent archetype in Bloomborough, so like it wasn't the top, but it was
okay. It was not,
Yeah, it was definitely a color pair I was willing to play for sure. Like I never caught it throughout the format, but I think that might have been the only. I'm forgetting which was the bad colors in that. Was the only blue deck I would play or the only green deck I would play? I don't know.
Yeah, blue was overall, I think, pretty bad there. Green
Okay.
was good in Bloomborough. Blue was not.
Yeah.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you think that we got some of these archetypes wrong, we'd love to hear from you in the comments, and we can talk about it in future videos.
So that's our thoughts on the Aetherdrift format. In our next episode, we'll be going over the top commons and uncommons in the set, as well as the cards where we see the biggest grading differences of at least a grade or more. So stay tuned for that, and see you in the next one.
See you in the next one.